Every summer camp has a list, names on a page, checked off one by one, so nobody gets left behind and nobody gets left out. But what happens when a name gets called that was never written down? I was 11 years old the summer I found out, and I promise you, the scariest part of this story isn't the part with the lake, or the old photograph, or the thing my friend forgot she used to know about herself. The scariest part is how normal it all felt, right up until it wasn't. This is a true account. I've changed nothing except the names, because some of the people in this story are still alive, still don't know what I know, and I'd like to keep it that way for them. Stay until the end, because by the time this story is over, you're going to start wondering about your own camp photos, your own middle name, and whether you've ever counted the faces around your own campfire twice, just to be sure. Every summer, on the first night, the counselors read the roster aloud by the fire. It was a small ceremony, the kind that becomes invisible through repetition. A name, a raised hand, a ripple of laughter if someone answered too late. The year I was 11, they called a name I didn't recognize, Colleen Ashby. A girl near the back of the circle raised her hand, and nobody thought anything of it, because why would you? 50 children, a dozen unfamiliar faces, one more name meant nothing at all. I want to be honest about how ordinary it felt. That's the part people never believe, when I tell this now, that the beginning of it was the least frightening thing that happened all summer. She was, for the first week, simply a girl in cabin 4, quiet, good at lanyard making, the kind of camper who blends so completely into a group that you have to work to remember she's there at all. And I only remember her at all now because of what happened after. It was Rosa, her bunkmate, who said the first thing that didn't sit right. We were lying in the grass during rest hour, and Rosa said, offhand, "The way you mention weather, Colleen says this is her 4th summer here." I said that was strange, because I'd never seen her before this year, and I'd been coming since I was 7. Rosa just shrugged. Maybe she's shy. I let it go. Children let a great many things go, at that age, because the adult world hasn't yet taught them which small wrongnesses are worth chasing. It would be nearly 2 weeks before I understood that this offhand comment, 4 summers, this is her 4th summer, was the first thread in something much larger, and that I had simply set it down in the grass and walked away from it. The second thread came from the office, and it came because of paperwork, not suspicion, which is, I think, the frightening part. Nobody went looking for what they found. It found them, in the ordinary business of filing. It was the second week before anyone checked the registration, and discovered there was no Colleen Ashby on record, no emergency contact, no cabin assignment on file, no deposit ever paid by any parent for any summer, current or otherwise. The head counselor, a woman named Diane, who did not strike me as someone who frightened easily, spent an entire afternoon on the phone. I know this only because I passed the office twice that day and heard her voice through the door both times, low and careful, the tone adults use when they're trying not to alarm a child who happens to be listening. She came out of that office looking like someone who has heard something and cannot yet decide whether to believe it. She didn't call the girl's parents. As far as any of us ever learned, she never found any parents to call. I remember watching her cross the yard afterward, back toward the mess hall, and I remember thinking, the way you think a small, private thought and immediately feel foolish for thinking it, that she walked like someone counting something in her head, over and over, and not arriving at the same number twice. Nobody told us anything that night. There was no announcement. Dinner happened the way dinner always happened. Colleen sat at her usual spot near the end of the table, ate her usual amount, laughed at something one of the other girls said, and Diane watched her the entire meal, over the rim of her coffee cup, without once looking away. This is where the story should have ended, or at least where I expected it to end, with a quiet administrative mystery, a girl with no paperwork, a summer that finished the way summers finish. It didn't end there. It turned. It turned because of old Frank, the groundskeeper, a man who had worked the property for 30-some years and said almost nothing to campers as a matter of principle. I only spoke to him because I was sent to fetch a rake from the equipment shed, and he was there, oiling the chain on a mower that hadn't run in years, and he asked me, apropos of nothing, whether the camp still had a girl in cabin 4 who kept to herself. I said yes, Colleen. He went very still. The oil rag stopped moving in his hand. Then he said, in a voice that had lost its usual gruffness entirely, that there'd been a Colleen Ashby at this camp before, a real one, registered and paid for and ordinary, 31 years earlier. She'd gone into the lake on a dare during the last week of August and hadn't come back out. The camp had closed for 2 full seasons afterward, while the family fought the county over what had happened, and nobody, in the 31 years since, had spoken that name out loud on this property. Until, apparently, this summer, when it was called out over a campfire like any other name on any other list, and a girl none of us had ever met raised her hand to claim it. "You sure it's the same name?" he asked me, not like he doubted it, like he was hoping, just once, that I'd tell him he'd misheard. I told him I was sure. He picked the rag back up and didn't say anything else, and I understood, the way you sometimes understand an adult's silence better than you understand their words, that the conversation was over because he didn't trust himself to keep talking. Did not sleep well that night. I lay in my bunk listening to the ordinary sounds of the cabin, someone's steady breathing, the creak of a frame when Rosa turned over, and every one of those sounds felt, for the first time all summer, like something I needed to keep track of. I told myself for a few days that a shared name was a coincidence, an unlucky one, but a coincidence, the kind of thing that happens more often than people like to admit. Camps have histories, names repeat, that's all it was, I told myself, every time I caught myself watching Colleen a little too closely across the mess hall. I stopped telling myself that the night Rosa forgot her own middle name. We were filling out camp postcards to send home. A simple exercise, first name, middle name, address, the kind of thing you don't even think about, and Rosa sat with her pen over the paper for a long moment before laughing, embarrassed, and saying she'd blanked. "It happens," she said. She'd tell me in a minute. The minute became the rest of the evening. By lights out, she still hadn't remembered it, and she was crying, quietly, in a way she tried to hide from the rest of us, saying it felt like reaching into a drawer she knew for certain existed and finding it simply gone. Not empty, gone, as though the drawer itself had never been built in the first place. I sat with her while she cried, and I didn't know what to say, because there isn't anything you can say to a friend who has just discovered a piece of herself missing and doesn't understand where it went, or when it left, or whether it's coming back. Colleen sat on the bunk across from us the whole time, watching, not saying anything. Her face wore an expression I can only describe as patient, not cruel, not pleased, just patient. The way you watch water come slowly to a boil when you already know, with total certainty, that it's going to boil. I looked over at her once, just once, and she looked back at me and did not look away, and something in that steadiness told me she knew exactly what was happening to Rosa and had known it before any of us did. I moved my things closer to the door that night. I didn't tell anyone why. I don't think I could have explained it if they'd asked. The fifth thing is the one I still have trouble saying plainly, even now, because it asks you to believe something about photographs that I have never fully managed to explain to my own satisfaction. The camp office kept a corkboard of old photos, decades of them, overlapping in rows. I went looking, after what old Frank told me, for any photograph from 31 years back, and I found one, curling and sun-bleached at the corners, a row of children standing in front of cabin 4, dated in faded pen to the correct summer. Colleen's face was there, not a resemblance, her face, exactly as it looked that week, down to the same patient stillness in the eyes, standing among children dressed in a style from 31 years before I was born, and beside her, in that old photograph, was a second girl whose face had been scratched away, not torn, not faded by weather or time, scratched, deliberately, carefully, the way you'd erase a name from a list you didn't want anyone to read again. I did not need old Frank to finish the story for me. I understood, standing in front of that corkboard with my heart going too fast in my chest, that this had happened before, that it would go on happening, that somewhere in this cycle, a name is called by a fire, a name that shouldn't still exist, gets to exist again for one more summer, and in exchange, something is scratched away to make room for it. A face, a middle name, a small piece of a life that a real, living child had every right to keep. I understood, too, standing there, that I had no way of knowing yet whose face it would be. Diane moved Colleen out of cabin 4 on what would have been her final night, quietly, without ceremony, into the office cabin, telling the rest of us there'd been a mix-up and that she'd finished the summer with the staff instead. Rosa told me, years later, that on that last night, she'd woken to find Colleen sitting up in the dark, watching her, and had asked, half asleep, what she was doing. "Practicing," Colleen said. "I don't get many chances to be someone." I believed, for a very long time, that the story ended there. A strange girl, quietly removed, a summer that closed the way summers close, a piece of folklore I carried out of childhood, the way you carry out a scar you can no longer quite recall the getting of. But 2 years ago, going through a box of old camp photographs with my own daughter, sorting them for an album, I found the picture from that summer, my cabin, my friends, the fire, the counselors, and there is a gap in the row of faces, third from the left, where I am almost certain, from the shape of the space and the way my friends are standing angled around it, that I should be standing. I have asked my mother whether she remembers my middle name. She answers without hesitation, the way you'd expect a mother to answer. It is not the name I have always believed was mine. I have not told her this. I am not certain, some nights, which of us has the story wrong, or whether wrong is even the right word for what happened at that camp 31 summers before I was born, and every summer since, and, I suspect, quietly, patiently, every summer still to come. Camp Willowbrook sat on 40 acres of pine and quiet, the kind of place brochures called rustic and parents called character building. There was a mess hall with a bell nobody used anymore, a row of cabins named after birds nobody could identify, and the lake, long, dark, and so still most mornings it looked less like water than like something waiting. The raft was the only interesting thing on it, 50 yards out, gray boards bolted to a rusted frame, the place every camper wanted to reach at least once before the summer ended. During the day, kids swam to it constantly, sunburned and shrieking, and nobody thought twice. It was only after dark that the rule kicked in, delivered every year in the same tired tone by whichever counselor drew the short straw. No swimming after sundown, currents get unpredictable, cold water does strange things to tired arms. It was a good enough explanation. I believed it for exactly 1 week, the way you believe most things you've never had a reason to test. Denny tested it on the 8th night. He was that kind of kid, not reckless exactly, just incapable of hearing don't, without needing to know what would happen if he did. Lights out came at 10. By midnight, the rest of us were lying very still, the particular stillness of children pretending to sleep so hard it becomes its own kind of wakefulness, and we heard the screen door ease open on its hinge, and then nothing, and then, faintly, from out on the water, laughing, Denny's laugh, delighted with himself. The sound carried the way sound does over flat water at night, clear and small and far away. Then it stopped, not faded, stopped, the way a radio stops when you unplug it mid-song, and the frogs stopped too, all of them, all at once, which none of us mentioned to each other until much later, because none of us had words yet for how wrong that was. The lake had never once been silent. It had its noises the way a house has its creaks. That night it had none, for as long as it took Denny to swim back, and the not knowing what he was doing out there in that silence was worse than anything we could have imagined him screaming. He came back through the screen door soaked to the skin, and would not answer a single question, just climbed into his bunk, faced the wall, and lay there so still I thought he might have stopped breathing too. In the morning he ate his eggs like nothing had happened at all. He was fine. That was the strange part. Not that something was wrong with Denny, but that nothing visibly was. He joked with the counselors at breakfast, needled the boy across the table about his snoring, ate 2 helpings of eggs like a kid with nothing on his mind at all. If I hadn't lain awake and heard that silence close over the lake like a lid, I would have believed him completely. But he never swam again. Not that afternoon, not the next, not for the rest of the summer. When the free swim bell rang, he found reasons to be elsewhere, helping in the kitchen, reading on the dock in his clothes, anywhere that kept him dry. The other boys noticed. Boys always notice the thing you're avoiding before they notice anything else about you, and within a few days they were calling him chicken, calling him worse, doing the cruel small-scale theater that 11-year-olds do to anyone who's changed and won't explain why. Denny just smiled. It wasn't his old smile. His old one had a gap in it where a tooth hadn't come in yet, careless and a little goofy. This one was calmer, settled almost, the expression of someone who's already had the worst conversation of the day, and everything after it feels like small talk. You don't understand, he told them, not unkindly. I already gave them something. I don't have to give them anything else. Nobody asked who them was. I've thought about that a lot since, how 12 children heard a sentence that strange, that specific, and not one of us pushed for more. I think we understood, on some floor of ourselves, too young to have a name for it yet, that there are questions you don't ask because some part of you already suspects the answer will cost you something to hear. It was 3 days later, on an afternoon canceled by rain, that I was sent alone to the equipment shed for life vests, and found the notebook that told me we'd all been right to be afraid. And right, too, not to ask. The shed smelled like rubber and mildew, the particular smell of things that spend more time wet than dry. I was digging through a bin of life vests, half listening to rain drum on the tin roof, when my hand caught the edge of something wedged behind a crate of paddles. A spiral notebook, swollen fat with damp, its cover long gone soft and gray. It wasn't camp records. I know now what camp records look like. Attendance sheets, supply inventories, the dull paperwork of running a place like Willowbrook. This was something else. A private log, kept year over year in a dozen different hands, some in careful cursive, some in the cramped block letters of someone writing fast and not wanting to be caught at it. I sat on an overturned bucket and read by the gray light coming through the shed's one window, and the same sentence kept surfacing, decade after decade, phrased almost identically each time, as if it were less a note than a ritual line copied forward. One went in tonight, one came back different, noted for continuity. Some entries had names, most didn't. A few had dates going back further than I could believe. 1961, 1974, 1988, always the same shape of event, always that word, continuity, like this was a process with a memory of its own, something that had been running long before any of us arrived, and would keep running long after we left. This wasn't Denny's first night. It wasn't even close. Someone had been keeping score on this lake for longer than my parents had been alive, and keeping it carefully, the way you keep the books on something you intend to balance every single year. I brought the notebook to Marsh. Marsh ran the waterfront. 22, quiet, the kind of counselor who actually watched the water instead of the girls on the opposite dock. I expected him to laugh, tell me it was some old camp legend somebody'd been embellishing since before color TV. He didn't laugh. He went very still, and when he took the notebook from my hands, he did it carefully, the way you'd take something that might still be capable of biting you. I swam out once too, he said. 94. I was a camper here. I asked him what happened. He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he told me the part that scared him more, all these years later, than whatever had happened to him in the water that night, that every adult at this camp already knew, had always known, had chosen, every single summer, to let the story about currents and cold shocks stand, because it was easier than the truth. It's not a secret, he said. It's a policy. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept thinking about the word policy, how ordinary it sounded, how bureaucratic, like something decided in a meeting, with coffee and a whiteboard, rather than whispered on a dock, by a boy who still hadn't told me what happened to him in 1994. Policies are things institutions have on purpose. Policies get reviewed, renewed. Someone, somewhere, had looked at whatever this was and decided it was worth continuing. Denny started sleepwalking that week. The first night, Marsh caught him at the tree line before he reached the water, feet already wet, pajama cuffs soaked to the knee, eyes open and fixed on nothing. He woke calm and a little embarrassed, the way you wake from an ordinary dream, with no memory of getting out of bed at all. The second night it happened again, the third, the fourth, always the same straight line through the dark toward the lake, always stopped at the same spot, like something had marked the boundary of where he was allowed to go without permission, and something else kept testing it anyway. It wasn't one transaction. I understood that now, watching him wake up confused each morning, rubbing his eyes, asking why his feet were cold. His body was paying a bill his mind didn't remember signing up for. Whatever he'd agreed to that first night hadn't been a single payment. It was a subscription, and it renewed itself whether he consented to the renewal or not. I started spending my free hours in the rec hall instead of the ball field, going through the shelf of old camp yearbooks nobody ever opened, looking for anything that might explain what continuity actually meant to whoever wrote that word down, year after year, like a promise they intended to keep. I found a boy in the 1987 yearbook, grinning by that same raft, sunburned and gap-toothed and completely unremarkable, the kind of photo that exists 1,000 times over in 1,000 camp yearbooks. Underneath it, someone had written a caption, and then, later, in different ink, someone else had crossed it out. I held the page up to the window to read through the strike-through, transferred schools. I didn't know yet what was wrong with that. I only knew, sitting there with rain starting up again on the tin roof, that I needed to find Marsh and ask him what happened to that boy in the fall. Marsh told me the truth when I pushed hard enough. The boy in the photo, his family had moved counties within a month of that summer ending. No warning to friends, no forwarding address anyone could ever confirm. Not then, not since. Marsh said it wasn't the only one. The pattern wasn't you swim, you get spooked, you're fine by September. Some of them weren't fine. Some of them simply stopped being reachable, and everyone, parents, counselors, whoever ran this place before the current director, had agreed, quietly, for decades, to call that normal, to call it a family moving, a kid growing apart from camp friends the way kids do. I found Denny at the dock that evening and asked him straight what actually happened out there. He wasn't dramatic about it. That was almost the worst part, how calm he was, like a man settling an old debt he'd made peace with. Nothing had grabbed him, he said. Nothing had chased him. Something had simply asked him a question, underwater, in the dark, his own name, offered back to him like a question, as if it wasn't sure the name still belonged to him. He'd answered, wrong. Or honestly, he still couldn't say which. What he'd given up wasn't blood. It was smaller than that, and stranger. His mother's maiden name, a fact he'd known his whole life without ever once having to think about it, was simply gone now, pulled clean out of him like a tooth. The socket healed over so smooth he could barely find the shape of what used to be there. It doesn't take big things, he said. It takes one true thing, and it keeps it. That's the whole deal. That's why nobody dies. Dying would make people stop coming. I went to the camp director next, expecting her to deny everything. She didn't. She sat me down in her office and told me, plainly, that Willowbrook had sat on this land since 1951 because the man who sold it had made this arrangement first, not for the camp, for the town. Something in that lake had been owed a yearly toll long before any child ever swam out to that raft, and a camp full of consenting, unknowing children had simply become the easiest way to keep the payment on schedule, small piece by small piece, so the town itself never had to pay in anything larger. Nobody's ever been hurt, she said. I understood she believed that completely, and I understood too, that her belief was the exact mechanism that let all of it keep running, year after year, notebook page after notebook page. The final week, Denny found me looking frightened for the first time all summer. The sleepwalking had stopped, he said, but that morning he'd tried to picture his mother's face, and gotten a half-second of static before it resolved, like a channel needing to retune. Marsh had explained what that meant. The toll wasn't a one-time fee. It renewed every year, and if the original swimmer didn't return to the water to settle it, the debt didn't vanish. It looked for the nearest full account instead. Mine, for instance. I now knew everything Denny knew, without ever having paid a cent of it myself. That last night I lay in my bunk and listened, and the frogs outside had gone completely silent. The same silence that had swallowed the lake the night Denny went in. I understood then that this was never a story about a boy who broke a rule once. It was a story about a lake with excellent bookkeeping, a camp that functioned as its collections office, and a town of adults who had decided, generations back, that a child's small, specific losses were an acceptable price for everyone else's ordinary life to go on undisturbed. I have not been back to Willowbrook since. I am 31 now, and there is a name, my grandmother's, I think, on my father's side, that I have been reaching for, and losing, for 11 straight years. Every time I reach for it, I feel something underwater turn its attention toward me, patient, unhurried, and find that I am still exactly where it left me. Every camp has a song, a silly one, usually, about fireflies, about friendship, about summers ending too soon, the kind of song you forget you even know, until one day, 20 years later, you catch yourself humming it while washing dishes. I did exactly that. And when my husband asked me to actually listen to what I was singing, I realized something that has not let me sleep properly since. It wasn't a song about friendship at all. It was a set of directions, and somewhere, 38 years ago, a 9-year-old child followed them. This is a true account. I am telling it now because 2 nights ago, I heard my own daughter, who has never been taught this song by me, or by anyone I know of, singing it under her breath in the next room. Stay until the end, because by the time this story is over, you may find yourself trying to remember the words to a song from your own childhood that you haven't thought about in years, and wondering, for the first time, what it actually says. There was a song the older counselors taught the youngest cabins, always on the second to last night, always around the fire. It had the shape of every camp song, a simple melody, verses about friendship and fireflies, and the sadness of summer ending. I learned it the way you learn any song you're taught as a child, without thinking about what it meant, singing the words because everyone around you is singing the words. There was one rule attached to it, and at the time it seemed like nothing more than camp superstition. You weren't taught the song until your 3rd summer, not your 1st, not your 2nd, your 3rd, as though the camp itself needed to be sure of you before it let you learn the words. I didn't think about that rule again for 20 years. I was 13 the summer I finally earned it, and I remember feeling absurdly proud. the way you feel proud of any small rite of passage a child's world hands you. The older counselors circled us in close around the fire that night, closer than usual, and sang it slowly, twice through, until we all had it. Afterward, nobody explained why the song mattered, or why the rule existed, or why the counselor leading it watched each of our faces so carefully while we sang, as if checking for something. Checking, I understand now, in a way I could not have understood then. I didn't ask. You don't, at 13. You just carry the song out of camp with you, the way you carry 100 other small traditions, whose meaning you never once questioned, and you sing it, occasionally, for the rest of your life, without a second thought. That's what I did for 20 years, until the evening I was doing dishes, and humming it absently, and my husband asked, from the next room, where on earth I'd learned a song like that. I laughed it off, told him it was just an old camp song, something I'd probably sung 100 times without ever really hearing it, and I kept humming, the way you do when you're not really thinking about the question anymore, just the melody. No, he said, more seriously this time, from the doorway now instead of the next room. Listen to what you're actually saying. I stopped with a plate half rinsed in my hands, and for the first time in my adult life, I said the words slowly, out loud, deliberately, not the automatic sing-along version a child keeps on a loop in the back of her mind, but the actual sentences, one at a time, the way you'd read something, instead of just remembering it. They weren't about friendship at all. They were directions, a path through the woods, past the second stone, where the birches lean, a clearing, where the ground goes soft and the light won't reach, and something else, something I had sung 1,000 times without ever once translating it. A debt, described in language just vague enough to seem poetic, right up until you actually stopped to work out what it meant, and specific enough, once you did, to turn your stomach. A manner of paying it, a promise, tucked into the melody like it belonged there, that whoever walked the path and paid what was owed would not be asked again for a very long time. I stood at the sink for a while after that, the water still running, and told my husband it was probably just old folk song imagery, the kind of strange, half-poetic thing that turns up in a dozen traditional songs and means nothing once you actually go looking for meaning in it. I told myself that too, for almost a week. I stopped telling myself that after I found the newspaper clipping. It happened almost by accident. I'd gone looking for the camp's name online one evening, mostly out of idle curiosity, wondering whether it still operated, whether the same cabins were still standing. What I found instead was a digitized local paper from 38 years earlier, a short article, 3 paragraphs, easy to miss if I hadn't already been looking so closely at everything connected to that place. A 9-year-old camper had gone missing on the last week of a summer session, never found. I almost scrolled past it. I would have, except for the sentence describing where the search parties had concentrated their efforts, past the second stone marker, near the birch stand, in the low clearing behind the ridge. I read that sentence 4 times before I understood I wasn't misremembering the song to fit the article. The article matched the song, almost word for word. I read the whole clipping 4 more times after that, and then I sat very still at my kitchen table for a long time, because I understood, all at once, that this had never been folklore. It was not a poetic old song about nothing, the way I'd been telling myself for a week. Someone, at some point, decades ago, had written real directions into a children's song and taught it, deliberately, to every incoming class of campers old enough to be trusted with it. And somewhere in the space between that missing 9-year-old and me, standing at my own sink humming without thinking, decades of ordinary, cheerful, singing children had unknowingly kept a root alive that not one of them understood they were memorizing. I thought about all those faces around the fire, watched so carefully, every single year, while they sang. I understood, finally, what the counselors had been checking for. This is the part I have the most trouble writing, because I did not remember it happening to me until I made myself go looking. I found my old cabin counselor after some effort, still living 2 towns from where I grew up, older now, a name I hadn't thought of in years but recognized instantly when it turned up in a search. I called her. I did not tell her why I was asking. I only asked, as casually as I could manage, whether anything unusual had ever happened on the last week of any summer she'd worked. She went quiet for long enough that I nearly apologized and hung up. Then she said, carefully, choosing her words the way people do when they're deciding, in real time, how much of the truth to hand over, that every few years, one child from the 3rd summer group would wander off during the last week, always found again within a few hours. Always fine, on the surface, always with no memory whatsoever of having left the cabin at all. She said the staff had a private name for it, one she wouldn't repeat, and that it had never once made it into an official report, and that she had told herself, every single time, that it was simply sleepwalking. I asked her, my voice steadier than I felt, if she remembered which children. She named 3, without much hesitation, the way you name things you've carried quietly for a long time and are almost relieved to finally set down. The third name was mine. I sat with the phone still in my hand for a long time after we said goodbye. I have no memory of walking anywhere that summer. I have only ever had one memory at all from that final week, waking in my bunk at dawn with wet shoes I could not explain, and deciding, the way children decide things without ever really deciding them, simply not to think about it. I have thought about almost nothing else since. I called my sister that night. I sang the first line of the song into the phone, not sure what I expected, for her to have forgotten it, maybe, or to laugh the way people laugh at a nursery rhyme that means nothing anymore. She sang the rest back to me instead, without hesitation, word for word, the whole thing, and laughed about how strange it was that we both still knew it after all these years. I let her laugh. Then I asked her the question I'd actually called to ask. I asked whether she remembered wet shoes too. The silence on the line went on long enough that I thought the call had dropped. I said her name. She was still there. "You're not supposed to add it up," she said, finally, her voice gone very quiet, a voice I didn't recognize from my own sister, careful in a way she had never once been careful with me. That's the whole point of teaching it as a song, instead of just telling us straight out. Nobody's supposed to notice they already paid, or that it comes back around every so often, generation after generation, camp after camp, so it never has to be the same family twice in a row. I asked her how she knew that, because my daughter came home last summer already knowing it, she said, word for word, and she's never even been to that camp. I asked her how that was possible, because it's not really the camp that keeps it going, she said. It never was. It's every kid who ever learned it, without meaning to, teaching it to the next one, however that happens. It doesn't need the same place anymore. It doesn't need the woods, or the fire, or the third summer. It just needs someone, somewhere, still humming it. She hung up before I could ask anything else. When I tried calling back, she didn't answer, and by the time I saw her again, at our mother's birthday that October, neither of us mentioned it. We have not mentioned it since. My own daughter turns 9 this year. 2 nights ago, half asleep in the next room, I heard her singing something under her breath that I had never once taught her, in a melody I recognized before I'd even let myself listen to the words. And when I asked her, gently, where she'd learned it, she looked up at me with a child's easy, untroubled honesty, and said she didn't know. She said it felt like she'd always known it. I have not told her to stop singing it. I am not sure, yet, whether stopping her would help at all, or whether some things, once they have found their way into a family, simply wait, patiently, without hurry, for their turn to come around again. I have started, without telling anyone why, checking her shoes every morning before she leaves for school.